Hello. My name is Derek Mosley. I'm the director of Marquette Law School's Lubar Center for Public Policy Research and Civic Education. It is my pleasure to welcome you to our On the Issues program today, focusing on the Marquette Law Poll, specifically on the state of Wisconsin. As usual, I'm joined by Dr. Charles Franklin, the director of the Marquette Law Poll. We have been doing for the last couple of times we've met, opening it up for questions, and we will continue to do that. There will be 2 breaks during this program where we will take questions, so you don't have to wait till the end of the program to ask your questions. But before we get started, I wanted to go over the topics of the day so that we all know what we're going to be covering. As usual, we always start with the methodology of the poll because I think it's important that everybody knows how we got to these numbers, how Dr. Franklin crunched them for us to discuss them today. We'll go over the presidential matchups, Vice-President Harris, former President Trump. We'll go through the Senate race as well, involving Tammy Baldwin as well as Eric Hovde. And we'll talk about the enthusiasm. How enthused are we, if we're entertained or not in regards to this poll. And my favorite part of the program is when we go through the individual issues that are important to the electorate here in Wisconsin. And then finally, if we have enough time, we'll go over the approval ratings of all the candidates. Dr. Franklin, welcome.
Good morning.
Good morning. Or afternoon now.
Let's get
now
this
it's
right.
afternoon. So let's start with the methodology of the poll before we get to the nuts and bolts.
Sure. So this is a fairly normal poll for us. We were in the field September 18th through the 26th. That was late last week. We interviewed 882 registered voters in the state. That has a margin of error of plus or minus 4.4 percentage points. And 798 likely voters, and that also has a margin of error of 4.4 points. We are using, as we did last time, this new likely voter model that's based on the people's voter registration record of turnout in the last few elections. And we assign each individual a probability of voting, and we use that for our likely voter model. More and more national polls are doing their polls that way. Partisan makeup of the sample is 34% Republican, 32 Democratic, 34 Independent. Since 2020, that long-term balance has been 30 Republican, 29 Dem, and 40 Independent. This sample, like last sample, is a little light on independents and a little heavy on partisans. But the reason for that is fewer people are saying they're independent but lean to a party, and more are saying they're simply partisan. So normally we'd have about 16% independents who lean Democratic and 16 who lean Republican. We're at about 13 of each this time. But the pure independents are about 11 or 12%. That's the normal who say they're independent and don't lean towards either party. So maybe this is just the politicization, the polarization of the campaign. People a little more likely to say Democrat or Republican when we ask the question, are you a Republican, a Democrat, or an independent, as opposed to saying independent and then saying, but I feel closer to the Republican or closer to the Democrat. So that accounts for the little shift in partisan makeup that we're seeing.
Now, before we move on to the next slide, I think it's important to say congratulations. The Marquette Law Poll just did its 70,000th interview. Is that correct?
More or less. Where's John? It's 70,060 something. Anyway, we're not quite up to 71,000. So we're closing in on it. We'll pass that next time.
All right. So how far are we out from the election?
We are 33 days. And they'll be so glorious. Everyone to be savored like a fine wine. So here we are, 33 days out, just over 4 weeks. And we've got a 4-point race in the presidential race. Harris 52, Trump 48. That is, notice the subtitle on the slide, that's true for both registered and likely voters. Some months we've seen more of a gap between registered and likely, but we're not seeing that much of a gap this time. So many of these numbers are the same for both registered and likely, and I put it on the slide if that's true. This was also a 4-point race last time, a month ago in the beginning of September. And it was a little tighter than that in July after Harris first got in the race, where Trump led by 1% with registered, but Harris led by 1% with likely voters. So take your money, pay your money, take your choice of which one of these numbers you focus on. But this 4-point margin held up last month, holds up again this time.
How does it change with when you bring on multi-val?
Yeah, well, we do have other candidates on the race, and it's still a 4-point race, at least among registered voters. 48-44, but here Kennedy at 3 is a drop from 6% in early September, and he was at 8% in July after Harris got in the race. So his numbers have been coming down. We'll show a slide on that in a minute. And then we have the other 5 candidates that are on the ballot for the fall, and you can see they get either 0 or 1% in the poll. And again, we'll come back to that and how that's changed. If you move to likely voters, there's just the smallest of change. It's 49-44, a 5-point margin for likely voters with the third-party candidates in the race. But it doesn't change Kennedy's 3%, for example, when you switch to likely.
Can we go through the trends? Because I know you've been trending this from last November to this coming November.
Yeah, one of the points I'd like to make this time, and we'll do one more poll for the state that'll be out at the end of the month, is how did we get here? Because we focus on where the poll is today, but I think there's value in saying how's this changed over time, if it's changed at all. So here's a look at the campaign, including Biden over on the left and the period where Harris is in the race, you can see. And so in the head-to-head candidate race, we had Biden up, then a tie, then Trump up, then a tie. So really close race for those two. When Harris gets in the race in that first poll, it's Trump by 1 that I mentioned a moment ago. But then in early September, Harris by 4, and it's still, Harris by 4. One of the things that's been going on, and it deserves attention here, is how partisans are dividing on the race. And so this is the Harris or Biden vote by party. So the blue line is for people who think of themselves as Democrats, gray for independents, and red for Republicans. And you can see that compared to Biden back in November of last year, just less than a year ago, Biden was getting in the low 90s from Democrats, and that rose to the upper 90s before he dropped out. Harris has gotten not only the high 90s, but last month she got actually 100% of Democratic voters, and it's 99%, I believe that number is this time. So it's a remarkably unified Democratic Party. In fact, if you want to worry about things about where the poll could be off, it's rare to get 100% of any group that agrees on something. And so it's possible that we're overestimating just how loyal Democrats are. Maybe there are disgruntled Democrats that aren't doing the poll or otherwise not identifying themselves as Democrats. But the numbers, as you can see, have been pretty consistent for the last several polls. So there's reason to take them seriously. With independents, you see that they were favoring Trump through the period when Biden was the candidate. They still favored Trump in the first poll with Harris, but then these last two have bumped up to 60 or a little above 60% of independents going for Harris. So I didn't emphasize that last month because independents are a small group, they move around a lot. But now seeing it 2 polls in a row, I think it's worth it to bring it up and show you that result. They could still change their minds. Sampling error could still play a role here. but seeing it twice in a row, I think, is worth noting. And then finally, Republicans on the bottom were at most giving Biden initially 10% of their votes, and that steadily came down. It's now about 5 or 6% crossover from Republicans. Then this is the same data, but now looking at the Trump vote by party. So you can see the unification of the GOP over the course of the year, starting out with Trump being only getting in the high 80% of Republican votes. He's now getting 95 or 94%. So a bit of an increase. You can also see where he went up with independents, but has now dropped off late in the game. And even Democrats had a little bit of crossover vote with Biden early in the year, and that's now dropped, as we saw in the previous one, to nearly zero for Trump.
What happens when you add multiple candidates?
Well, here's the trend with the multi-candidate. The one notable difference is Trump had a small lead in the multi-candidate race in the 3 polls we did with third-party candidates in the spring, whereas Harris has led by a little bit in the first one and by a little bit more, 4 points in the last 2. But the main point I want to make here is the Kennedy trend, that orange-colored line. That's gone from 16% for Kennedy to 13 to 8 to 8 to 6 and now to 3. That's not unusual for third-party candidates to see their support dissipate, but this is a lovely illustration of that phenomena taking place. And you can even see that the other third-party candidates weren't getting much, but they were getting more back in the winter than they are now when they're all at either 0 or 1%. So there has been some dissipation of third-party vote. Put that together, it's a total of 6% voting third party right now. The high this century is 5.5% of the actual vote in 2016. And so right now, the independent vote is just a smidgen higher than that actual vote was then. On the other hand, in 2020, it was just 1.5% of all third-party votes together. So we're still seeing a, whoop, drop my napkin, it's okay. As long as I don't need it, I'm going to borrow yours.
Use mine, yeah.
Okay. So it's come down quite a bit from the 24% that we saw early in the year to about 6 now, but still higher than we normally see. We'll see if it drops more in the final vote and the final poll.
All right, so before we go any further, are there any questions in regards to the head-to-head matchup between Harris and Trump? Oh, we're gonna have a microphone come on over so everybody can hear you.
You may or may not be able to answer this, but how do these trends between the top 2 candidates compare to trends that we saw from polls in like 2016 and 2020? Because everyone knows in 2016, Trump defied all the polls and ended up winning.
That's right.
So how are we seeing that into play?
We're seeing a smaller advantage for Harris now that she's in the race than we were seeing for Biden in 2020 or we were seeing for Clinton in 2016. So it's 4 points now. It was running 5 to 7 point leads, and at least over different polls in the fall in those previous times. So a little bit smaller. The other thing is you're not going to hear me talk much about change, at least in this presentation, because looking at it, there's been very little change over the last 3 polls since Harris got in. So things don't look like they're very dynamic, whereas in some previous races, we'd see more change from poll to poll as events maybe move the electorate a bit one way or the other.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Sort of a related question. To substantially reduce the margin of error from about 4.5% to say 1 or 2, how big would your sample have to be? You
have to quadruple the size to cut the margin of error in half. So if we wanted to go from these are rough numbers, but about right. If we wanted to go from 4.4 to 2.2, we'd have to go from nearly 900 respondents to 3,600. So if you'd like to finance quadrupling the sample size, I'd love to talk to you after the event. But this is why you rarely see samples more than about 1,400 or 1,500, because it just reaches a point of diminishing returns. And there's all the other sources of uncertainty. Who doesn't answer your poll? Who does? How does the question wording affect it? How do things change between a poll and election day? So that's why, as a cost-benefit decision, most pollsters, certainly in state polls, settle on between 600 and 1,000 respondents. We're in the high 800s this time, and that's why we end up where we do.
Any other questions? Closer to you. Yep.
I don't know if you're able to tell from the poll, but where do the Haley voters go when the ones that left Trump?
Sure. What we've seen over the course of the year is that back in November of last year and January, about 30% of Republicans said they had an unfavorable view of Donald Trump. And by the end of the campaign, Haley was getting 85, 86% of their votes. That number of unfavorable to Trump Republicans has come down to around 20 or a shade under 20% now. But the crossover vote is still only 6%. So that gap between, let's round it off and say between 6 and 20% is 14% of Republicans not favorable to Trump, but still unwilling to cross over and vote for the Democratic candidate. So that's not unusual. Partisans do find it very hard to cross over. Democrats find it very hard to cross over for a Republican if they don't like their candidate. That was true in Biden's case earlier, where a fair number of Democrats were negative towards him, but certainly didn't cross over to vote for Trump. So that's where it is. There are disgruntled Republicans, but it's a much smaller group now than it was a year and a half ago, and the crossover vote is still quite small.
Do you call both landlines and cell phones? And if so, how do you get cell phone numbers, and do you distinguish at all between them?
Yeah, no, cell phone numbers are just as easy to get as landline numbers, has been for 20 years. 80% of our phone interviews are done by cell, 20% by landline. But 80% of our sample is completed by people responding online. We send an email and a text message inviting them to complete the survey online. As I say, 80% do that. Of those that don't respond in the next couple of days after the invitation and after a reminder or two, we then start phoning, and that's where we get the final 20%. But 80 cell, 20% landline.
All right. So let's move on to the Senate race. Where does it stand with Baldwin and Hovde?
Well, this one's a 7-point lead for Baldwin, and that's again true for both registered and likely voters. That's a tick up from 4 points early in September. Overall, since we've been asking about the Senate race after Hovde got in, the race has ranged between a 4-point Baldwin lead and a 7-point Baldwin lead. We've had 7s before. This is not suddenly the highest. But it did shift just a little bit in Baldwin's direction this time. If we look at people who say they're undecided, so we ask two questions. One is, who would you vote for, or haven't you decided? Then we ask, if you had to choose, who would you vote for? That first number was with who, if you had to choose. But if we include the undecideds, then it's 10% undecided and a 5-point Baldwin lead. That 10% is down from where it was earlier in the year. You can see it here with the trend all along. So the gray line is undecided, and that was up around 18% right after Hovde got in the race in April. Came down a little bit, then came down some more, and now has dropped to 9% last time, 10% this time. And the Baldwin lead just a shade tighter this time when you include those undecideds. Oh, we also want to look at it by party and how's the vote shifted by party. You can see Baldwin consolidating the Democratic vote, that blue line going up. She, unlike Biden, Baldwin had been winning the independents all year long, but by just a little bit in the June and July polls, but now has picked up significant support, getting over 60% of independents in each of the last two polls. And finally, the red line, Baldwin did have a little bit of a crossover vote, starting at about 12% of Republicans. That's worked its way down to as little as 5% and is back up to about 7 or 8% this time. Here's the opposite for Hovde. You can see he's consolidating the Republican support as that's gone steadily up, though a slight dip this time. And independents, where he was low, then he got quite competitive for two polls, but then the last two polls has slipped with independents. And Democratic crossover vote was no more than about 6% and has fallen to nearly nothing. We do have third-party candidates in the race, Anderson and Leaguer. They're each getting 1 percentage point, and with them in the race, Baldwin's lead is 6 points for both registered and likely voters. So 7 or 6 point margin, maybe as little as 5 if you include those undecideds and how that affects the race. Consistently a modest Baldwin lead, but it has held on steadily. We haven't seen Hovde up in any of our polling, though we did have one where he was tied with among likely voters. That was early on.
Before we move on, any questions in regards to the Hovde-Baldwin race?
So are you saying that Baldwin has a 10% lead as of the last poll?
No, she has a 7-point lead in the last poll.
In
Yeah, no, in this one it's a 7-point lead, and it could be as little as 6, but it's still 6 or 7. So a significant lead, one that, as I say, has moved around a little bit from as little as 4 to as much as 7, but it's at 7 this time.
Any other questions on the Baldwin-Hovde race?
We'll come back in a minute to look at favorability and characteristics of the Senate candidates, and that'll flesh this out a little bit more.
All right, let's move on to who's more likely to win.
Well, I think you know, if you've listened to these, who I think the right answer is. It's the 11% that say they don't know. But we are at 50% saying Harris is likely to win the presidency, the presidential election, not win in Wisconsin, but win the election. 39 for Trump. There's been a trend on this. This is beginning when Harris got in the race. So in that first poll with Harris in, Trump was actually a little over 50% believing he would win, but that's reversed in the two polls since, with Harris a little under 50% last time and just barely hitting 50%, while Trump has fallen off to just over 40% and now just under 40%. But again, as you know, I like the don't knows. I think that's, this is an awfully close race if you look at the Electoral College across all the states. I would not place a large bet on this.
Now, you've been asking this question lately in lieu of our politics and our division amongst families. So could you go through that question? I'm not talking to you because of politics.
That's it. We've been asking this actually since 2012 in individual elections. So the way we asked it this time is there anyone you have stopped talking with about politics due to disagreements over the election for president? We've asked that in 16 and 20 and this year. And we also asked a version of it about slightly different wording about the gubernatorial recall election in 2012. So we've got a bit of a perspective here. In this poll, 46% say they've stopped talking about politics with someone. A slight majority, 54%, still say they have not done that. I don't have a slide on it, but I'll just tell you, Democrats are considerably more likely to say they quit talking than Republicans. Independents had been less likely to not talk, but this time they're close to the Democrats with close to 50% saying they're not talking. So there's a bit of partisan difference there. And then we have the trend in these. And it's interesting that, we thought the recall was a little conflictual back in 2012. And about 36%, 35% then, just the week before the recall election, said they'd stop talking to somebody. That was hardly changed in 2016 and hardly changed again in 2020. All of those are 34, 35, 36%. So the bump up this time to 46% is a 10-point bump, and it does stand in a little contrast to how little movement there was off of 3 pretty exciting elections that only now do we see this kind of shift take place. Still a minority, but getting to be a large minority.
Now moving on to your favorite topic. Are we 2 exclamation points this time? Are we enthused?
So good for you to notice that. And the reason is enthusiasm is up again. The green line is this year. The purple line is the same period in 2020. And you can see how unenthusiastic we were with Biden as the candidate through June. Then the sharp uptick in July with Biden dropping out and Harris in. And now the last 2, we've seen modest but noticeable further increases. In both July and early September, we were still slightly below enthusiasm of 2020. This time, we're slightly above where we were at this point in 2020. So enthusiasm is definitely back. The big move had been among Democrats, who were really downtrodden and forlorn until Biden left the race. And then you saw this really sharp increase in July, and then another big increase in early September. Remember, that was right after the Democratic convention, so that could be part of the game. And it's been flat this time, down a point from where it was in early September. But not to be missed is that Republican enthusiasm also moved up after the Republican convention. You can see where that happens. Then it was about the same in early September, but now it's moved up again this time. So whereas Democrats had been way behind and then almost caught Republicans and then pulled noticeably ahead of Republicans, this time with the rise for Republicans and this slight downturn for Democrats, they're now quite close to one another with a small Democratic advantage. And then the last thing are these pesky independents who have not been enthusiastic about this race. They've been down in the 30s for being very enthusiastic and didn't move up last time, but did move up this time. I've warned you, and will again, that they're a small part of the sample and they can bounce around a lot. But this is an interesting movement, and you can see it's relatively big movement compared to the change from poll to poll in recent polls. So some movement there, and people are getting engaged with 33 days to go. Still plenty of time to get registered, get a mail ballot, or show up to vote early, or wait till Election Day.
So I want to go to this one because this used to be the one where we used to have our double haters.
Yes.
So it's refreshing this next chart because they seem to have disappeared.
Yeah, well, by enthusiasm, the thing that's going on here is that the very or somewhat enthusiastic are giving Harris a 4-point lead, the same as her overall lead. But those who are not so enthusiastic are favoring Trump by 2, 49-51. When I showed you this last time, it was the not at all enthusiastic that were giving Trump a really substantial lead. And that earlier when Biden was in, it was Trump leading with the very enthusiastic, Biden leading with the not enthusiastic. Most of those differences, as you can see, have now dissipated. We're really not seeing huge differences with enthusiasm, maybe slightly more of a Democratic advantage with the enthused and slightly more of a Trump advantage with the not so enthused. But it's not nearly the chasm that we saw with Biden or the early sharp differences we saw with Harris as the candidate.
How do we like these candidates?
Oh, we love them. Not quite. They're all net negative except for Tim Walz. This was also true last time. None of these have moved very much since last time. They moved a point or so, so not worth troubling too much about. You can see Harris at a net -3 with a 47-50 favorable, unfavorable. And only 3% now say they haven't heard enough about her. That number was up around 12% before she got in the race a year or so ago when we had asked about her. So people have, not surprisingly, formed opinions about her. For former President Trump, it's a -11 net favorability, 44 to 55, only 1% lack an opinion of him. And then J.D. Vance at -13, 38 unfavorable, 51 favorable, 38 favorable, 51 unfavorable, and 11% that don't have an opinion of him. Again, sort of similar to where Harris was a year ago. And Walz at +7 is 45 to 38, but with a sizable 16% that still don't have an opinion of him. As you see for both VP nominees, they're not nearly as well known as the presidential nominees. They've both become better known since they were picked for the VP spot. And Vance has had a month more of time to introduce himself. So there are still some differences. And then Kennedy and the other third-party candidates are all net negative. It seems to have run off the bottom of the page. But they're all net negative. But the big point there is very few people have opinions about the third-party candidates other than Kennedy.
Now, you trended the enthusiasm, favorability, actually.
Yeah. Yep. So here's Trump's favorability. Again, I want to emphasize this. How did we get to where we are? What's changed over the last year? You can see the green line moving up for Trump. He's become more favorable, though he's still net negative, but he has become more favorable over the year, and his unfavorables have come down a bit. If we look at Harris, where the poll director didn't have the wisdom to include her in all the polls until she got in, so we don't have a trend line for her. But her favorable number and her unfavorable numbers have both moved since she got in, with the favorables taking a notable tick up from the July poll, which was done the week after she got in the race. Took a tick up and has not really changed this time. Her unfavorables have gone down a couple and then down one more. And you can see the gray line, people without an opinion got smaller. So fairly stable, modest amount of change for her.
Now, this is I told you at the last poll that I enjoyed that you broke down individual candidates and the phrase that describes them, but you took it a step further. You actually put a number on that. So can we take a look at how well the phrase describes each candidate in Wisconsin?
The continued graphical improvement, we now put numbers on the dots so you can read the numbers. So these are the questions about how well does each of these phrases describe each candidate. And too old to be president, 61% say that describes Trump, 13% Harris. Has behaved corruptly, 63 Trump, 41 Harris. Has a strong record of accomplishment, 52 Trump, 45 Harris, that's a Trump advantage. Is a strong leader, they're very close, 53 Trump, 52 Harris. And then we switch to those that Harris has an advantage on. Shares your values, 51 Harris, 45 Trump. Then is intelligent, 60-54, 6-point margin. Is honest, 50-42, an 8-point margin. And then finally, has the right temperament, 58 for Harris, 43 for Trump. Some shifted in obvious ways. When Biden got out of the race, he was the guy that was too old to be president. 76% said that of him back in June. And a little more said Biden had behaved corruptly than, say, that of Harris. But these shifts that we do see, and Harris has a little more of an advantage on the ones towards the bottom of the chart, those are the things that have shifted by replacing Biden with Harris. But there hadn't been a whole lot of change in the 3 polls that we've got Harris in. And Trump perceptions of Trump are pretty stable as well.
So which candidate would do a better job on the issues?
My candidate would, of course. And I know your candidate would as well, whoever that might be. So what we've got is, this is where there's been so little change despite the change of candidates. The issues that Trump had an advantage on in June with Biden, he still has the advantage on. The issues that Biden had an advantage in June, Harris still has an advantage on, and those really haven't shifted much. Harris's advantages are a little bit larger than they were for Biden, and Trump's advantages are a shade smaller than they were against Biden, but there hadn't been a wholesale rewriting of the issue landscape. So the biggest Republican advantage is on immigration and border security. And that yellow dot on the left is the percent that say they don't see any difference between the 2 candidates. So even on immigration, 14% say they don't see any difference between Harris and Trump. The Israel-Hamas war, again, a Trump significant advantage, but 22% saying they don't see a difference. The economy, 50 for Trump, 42 for Harris. That's an 8-point gap. It was in the mid-teens earlier in the year with Biden, so that is one where the gap has closed some, but it's still a not trivial Trump advantage, and 9% say no difference. Handling foreign relations, Trump by a little bit. He's had a little bit of an advantage on that one all year. Ensuring fair elections, Harris with the advantage. Medicare and Social Security, Harris with the advantage. Health care, Harris. And abortion policy is the one that she has the biggest advantage on, 53 to 46, but 10% don't see a difference on that issue either. These don't see a differences are all down from near 20% with Biden in the race, so there is a shift there. But it's still 1 in 10 or more who are not seeing differences on each of these issues.
What are the most important issues to us in Wisconsin?
It's been a small change here. The economy is still number 1 by a big margin. Last time, abortion was second and immigration was 3 points behind abortion. Now they're tied at 15% each, citing them as most important. And then Medicare and Social Security is in 4th place, as it has been for a while. It's an easy issue to overlook, but a not trivial number of people still pick that. And as you'll see, especially among independents, pick it. And then the others are well below 10%. I'm, for the sake of time, going to skip past that. Here it is by party, and you can see the red dot at the top. Republicans, 53% say the economy is their number 1 issue, and 31% of Republicans say immigration is their top issue. But then all of the other red dots are way down to the left, way over to the left. They just don't motivate Republicans the way these top 2 issues do. For Democrats, the top issue is abortion policy, with the second issue being economy, a fair bit back. And then Medicare and Social Security and health care tie for next place, 3rd place for Democrats. For independents, the economy at 39% up there is still their number 1 issue. But their number 2 is Medicare and Social Security, and that's why I mentioned it a moment ago. It is notable that independents don't put immigration or abortion as their second issue. They actually put Medicare and Social Security. And again, we've seen this in multiple polls this year, that issue does seem to have a real grip on independents.
All right, so we're moving on to the Senate candidates, I believe?
So I promised you we'd get to the Senate candidates in a little more detail. In terms of favorability, Baldwin is at 47-47 for a net 0, no difference. Hovde's at 36.45, a net -9, and 18% say they haven't heard enough about Hovde. This is Baldwin's trend over the year, and I think the notable part is neither the green nor the purple line have moved very much. They've bounced a little more unfavorable, a little more favorable, or tied a couple of times, but not much movement there. A little bit of a decline in the percent saying they haven't heard enough about her, from about 15% last year to just about 5% or 6% now. There's been a lot more action with Hovde. And here, the biggest thing, of course, is the gray line, over 80% that didn't know enough about him in late January. That's down to 18% now, so he has acquainted himself to the public. Both his unfavorable and favorable lines have been moving up as people get to know him. This month and last month, he was at -9, so there wasn't a net change in favorability between last time and this time. He had a little bit improved his net favorability last time compared to the poll before that, but no further movement one way or another. We also ask about how well do these phrases describe each of the candidates. And Baldwin has a lead on each, but it's a variable lead. We'll work to solve our national problems. 54% say that describes Baldwin, but 50% say it describes Hovde, just a 4-point Baldwin edge on that. Is someone who cares about people like me. She has a 9-point lead, 56-47, and is committed to serving the interests of Wisconsin. Same 9-point lead, 60-51. These have shifted just a little bit from last time, but the leader is the same in all of them. It is notable that the closest this race gets is on solving national problems, and the stronger advantage is on committed to serving the interests of Wisconsin.
So can you show us the trends for the approval ratings?
Sure. So this is Biden approval. And this is more substantive than you might think, more important than you might think. Joe Biden's approval ratings are terrible. And I think any skipping over of that is a big mistake. This is a weight. It was a drain on the Democrats when Biden was the candidate. I think it is still a drain on the Democrats today. And you can see that getting out of the race did very little to improve his job approval. So to the extent that this is a referendum, this election is a referendum on the Biden administration, this is a real drain, that and negative views of the economy. To the extent that Harris can step out of that shadow, as you can see with favorability, she does considerably better. But I don't think you should underestimate that. The other is we ask, do you approve or disapprove of the way Trump handled his job when he was president? And he's still net negative, but he's better than Biden is at this point, and has stayed relatively the same. You can see it bumped a little bit last time. So net job approval, Trump is doing considerably better than Biden is doing. And that, too, is a bit of an advantage for him, but still net negative. By the way, where he is right now is just about where he was 4 years ago before the election. So this is not either a rosy recollection of where he was, nor is it a pessimistic recollection. It's really very similar to where he was in the fall of 2020.
Let's shift our focus to the state real quick.
Okay. Right direction or wrong track? The green line is right direction. It's gotten better over the course of the year, but wrong track has been the champion in this contest for 4 or 5 years, at least since COVID hit. So a little bit of an improvement over a year, but it's still underwater and still substantial pessimism about how the state's headed. And you can see this month a little bit of an upturn in wrong track and downturn on right direction. People's family finances have been relatively stable, but the green line is people saying their personal finances mean they are living comfortably. And you can see it went down a little bit over the course of the year, though it's ticked up a little bit this time. It's still hovering in the high 40s, 48% this time. But in 2019, that was up in the 60% range. And so this is the other side of the burden of Biden's economic outcomes, or at least as people perceive them. There's a dramatic difference between how people felt about their personal finances in 2019, pre-COVID, and where they feel themselves now. The gray line is just getting by, and the red line is struggling. And you can see neither of those has moved a whole lot, but there's been a small dip in just getting by and a tiny dip in struggling this month.
Move on to Evers and
job approvals. So this is Tony Evers' job approval. He's been over 50% all year, but he dipped under this time. This is the first time in a year that he's been below 50%, though still more approved than disapproved by a point or two. But there's been just this little bit of movement in this last month. Notice that also parallels the change in states headed in the wrong direction or off on the wrong track. I don't know if that's substantive or not. Obviously, most of our news attention is focused on the presidential campaign and the Senate campaign, but it's at least worth pointing out that this is the first time we've had him under 50 since during the 22 re-election campaign when he dipped under 50% as well.
It appears the legislature is not very
Yeah, I always feel like I'm beating up on the legislature because people just don't like legislatures. They don't like Congress, but they keep reelecting their legislator or keep reelecting their congressman or congresswoman. So there's not been a lot of movement in this. Of course, the legislature's been relatively inactive in recent months as the session was over. So there's not much reason for that to move. Do notice that don't have an opinion about them has gone up, and that probably makes sense. If they're out of the news, we're not going through a budget cycle when the legislature's especially active. A few more people lack an opinion of them. And then finally, the state Supreme Court is net positive, but below 50%. But with them, the don't know enough to have an opinion is especially high. That's true of the U.S. Supreme Court when we ask about them as well. Courts generally are not the first thing people wake up to read about in the morning. And so a substantial don't know.
By the way.
You do. I'm sure you do.
Courts are very important.
Courts, totally important. So's getting people married, right? Which judges get to do. So that's the basic trends in all of these things, and it's where we've put ourselves just before the election, 33 days out. I guess we'll go to that slide. Close race still, 4 points. Again, remember, not that I really want to remind you, but we were off by 4 points last time in 2020. We were off by over 6 in 2016. So fair warning, these results could change. We could be wrong. On the other hand, we could be right. And there are other polls in the state showing a closer race, a 1 or 2 point race typically. So I advise you to go to your favorite website like Real Clear Politics or 538.com and look at all of the polling being done in the state and see what the range is there.
How many polls do we have left before the election?
An infinitely large number. Now, we have one more state poll. That'll be out on the 30th, the Wednesday before the election, like we always do. We'll also be doing a national poll that's in the field now and will be out in a couple of weeks. But that's it. And then we'll do a post-election national poll in early December to look back and see how people feel about the outcome of the election. Once we know what that is, which hopefully will be by December.
Any questions in regards to this version of the Marquette Law Poll? Yep. We'll start here. We're bringing you a mic.
Take this question as more naive than judgmental.
Sure.
You're ready.
Despite the science in polling, and it's always impressive, polls vary by their source, Rasmussen, Pew, the media, and they seem to mirror what might be seen as the underlying ideology of the pollster, even though the science of the questions is so nonpartisan. Do you think that's true, first of all, and how do you think it happens?
Yeah. There are several ways that it happens that are completely honest ways. If you're working for a Democratic candidate or interest group or a Republican candidate or interest group, the kinds of questions you ask will reflect some of that point of view. I don't mean in a biased way, but I mean just look at what people think are important. If you're a Republican pollster, you might ask a lot more about immigration and employment. If you're a Democratic pollster, you might ask a lot more about abortion or Medicare. And so those are legit questions for both sides to ask, but it frames the whole survey in slightly different ways. There are professional differences about what you think the population of voters is going to be like on Election Day. So some pollsters have their own formula or methodology for saying, well, I think the final Election Day electorate in Wisconsin will be +4 Republican. But maybe somebody else thinks it'll be +1 Democrat. And so if they do their polls with those assumptions built in, that's how you get some of those effects. And there are a lot of other technical things that I won't go into. And then there's just old-fashioned bias in that if you're working for a partisan clientele, you tend to want your polls to not be wrong, but to present the best case for them. And we do see that. If you look at the final pre-election polls for statewide races over a 10-year period, which I did from 98 to 2008, Democratic pollsters were consistently 5 points more margin in favor of the Democrat. Republican pollsters were consistently 5 points more in the margin for the Republican candidate. And the nonpartisan pollsters were right in the middle and on average were hitting those races about right. So the good news is if you look at a partisan pollster, subtract 5 points on the margin for the candidate that they favor, and you'll actually be pretty close to what the nonpartisan pollsters are showing. And then, of course, we have good old-fashioned error as well, simply because not everybody answers our polls, and that's a problem. Yeah.
How did you phrase the question on the Hamas-Israeli war, and then why did you choose that question instead of the Ukrainian war?
Oh, we've asked about Ukraine in the national polls a lot. It's just a matter of how much space we have in the survey. But we asked about Ukraine in every national poll after the war began. We asked about Israel and Hamas after the conflict developed there. And in terms of, well, you saw the question here. Who do you think would do a better job on handling the war between Israel and Hamas in Gaza, is the wording of it. Now, events in the Middle East are changing right now, so maybe we'll have new questions in the future, but you don't want to change the wording of that in the middle.
How'd you ask the question about the Bears versus Packers?
There's only one right answer, and you, sir, are on the wrong side of it.
Thank you. You mentioned a number of trend lines. Do you use any of those trend lines to predict a curve into the future? And can you speak to the value of those kind of things?
Sure. In my misguided youth, I tried that stuff, and oh, it's terrible. Don't do it. And it's terrible for some good statistical reasons. And it's terrible because events can always happen between the time of the poll and Election Day. How many people, well, maybe I shouldn't ask this, you'll all claim you saw it, saw Biden dropping out? I did not. But the debates, how do they go? You know, perhaps, well, events in the Middle East. All of these things can change the results between the time even a perfect poll is done and Election Day. And not to geek out too much, but the statistical power we have for predicting election outcomes is inherently limited because we have one election every 4 years for president. Now, folks like Nate Silver at 538, or formerly 538, now natesilver.com, they use all 50 states to make a prediction state by state and gain a little more chance. But we're still nothing compared to those guys that predict the weather who get to do 365 days a year, if not hourly by hourly forecasts. So my technical point is doing sophisticated statistical models of future election outcomes is terribly difficult in a purely technical sense that we don't have as much information as we do if we're forecasting the weather. And so that's why I'm especially skeptical. I think looking at the polling averages, which I've already advised you to do, is a good way to sort of see where the race seems to stand right now. But then you're free to make your own guesses about how that evolves. But simply taking a trend line and projecting it out is statistically a terrible thing to do. And it just doesn't work very well either. Lastly, right now, the range of forecasts for the probability of a Harris win range from about 58% probability to about 51 or 2%. And I just want to ask, how on earth, after the election is over, will you know whether the 58% was more accurate than the 52%? And my answer is you simply won't know. Whereas you will know whether my poll was pretty accurate or pretty terrible. And so there is a basis for judging whether the polling ends up close to what the outcome is after the fact. We don't know it before the fact. Whereas I think these election forecasting models are an interesting statistical exercise, but the ability to say that one is better than another is just really, really weak from a statistical point of view. Okay. Sorry for the Stats 101 lecture, but I can't avoid it.
How do you, excuse me, how do you select who you actually contact?
Sure.
And number two, is anybody from poll to poll contacted more than once?
We sample from the registered voter list. So that's a public document, and commercial firms provide those to pollsters. So the sample originally is that. Then those firms have phone numbers and emails that they've linked to the name and address so that we can send those email and text messages or phone them if we have to. We also do have about 20% of the sample that were sampled by home addresses. And those folks were recruited to do polls through the U.S. mail. We send them a letter, not we, but the company we use, sends them a letter. They agree to do polls over time. And so those people in principle can be recontacted, but we don't set out to recontact people over and over again. We try to get mostly a fresh sample each time, but over the course of the year, some of those people with address-based samples may be recontacted, but we don't track that. It's not enough for us to look at whether individuals have changed their minds. So 75 or 80% are registered voter list, brand new sample every time, and that 20% may include a few people who are interviewed more than once.
Pundits say that Wisconsin polls are the least predictive. Why do you think that is?
Well, just look at the averages. I told you we were off by 4 points in 2020, but the average Wisconsin poll was showing a 7 or 8 point Biden win. And, you know, New York Times had it 11 points for Biden. UW-Madison had it 9, I think. ABC, Washington Post had it a 17-point lead. So on average, those folks those folks. Notice how I escaped responsibility here. It is hard to poll here because we don't have voter registration by party, so you don't know that, which you do have in other states. And we're just such a close state. I like to think we do a bit better, and on average, we clearly do better than the average pollster in the state. Our average error is 2.2 points, though, again, off by 4 last time. Partly because we know the state, partly because we designed the sample just for Wisconsin. We're not some East Coast pollster, he said, getting a dig in, whose day job is not polling Wisconsin, and our day job is polling Wisconsin. But again, I have to say, I don't want you to think that the Marquette poll is going to be absolutely right. That's wrong for any poll. On average, we've been more right than wrong, but everybody can be off. But I do think after the 2016 and 2020 experiences, first of all, some of those pollsters quit doing Wisconsin altogether. And all of us have adjusted our methods to try to do a better job this year than we did in 2020 or 2016. But we'll only know whether that paid off sometime in late November, when the votes are certified and we can compare the actual outcome. Okay?
Well, thank you, Dr. Franklin. Thank you all for being here. I will.
One thing.
Oh, go ahead.
Sorry. We usually only do this at the last poll release, but with early voting and all, I'll just say, polls don't vote, people do. So for goodness sake, don't pay attention to me. Go out and make up your mind and vote for whoever you want to vote for. Early or late, I don't care, but just go out and do it.
We will see some of you who are lucky enough to get into the Hispanic Heritage Dinner this Sunday. Please join us October 16th, where we have a program where I'll have a conversation with our newly elected city attorney, Evan Goyke. So hope to see you then.